we would have to see at the convention if the delegates that have pledged for Joe Biden in this moment would be willing to shift. And I think politically it would require Joe Biden to step aside and to allow those delegates for the Electoral College to go with a different nominee. It's stunning to imagine that we are here.
Rachel, I mean, it's painful to listen to, isn't it, really, and to watch?
I've watched that clip so many times and I was still wincing listening to it just then. Yeah. The weird thing about this was a debate that Joe Biden's team wanted him to have. They pushed for it to be early, and the idea was that it would showcase that Trump is dangerous, that he lies, that he can't be trusted, yeah, and that Joe Biden is all that's standing in the way of a second Trump presidency. And it was basically the opposite. I think the panic that we've seen since the debate from Democrats, leading Democrats, on is this guy really going to be our candidate, kind of says it all. I think there are some big questions as to why they let the debate go ahead, big questions about why it is that people around Biden who will have known that this was what he was like kind of kept pushing for him to be the candidate, and questions about whether the Democrats can replace him as a candidate before November's election. It's worth saying, as you made clear, that Trump also basically lied his way through it and said a number of things that are pretty wild, even by the standards of American politics. But it wasn't reassuring for those of us who are worried about the future of Western democracy.
James, I've said this many times on the show this afternoon, but I'm still in disbelief that this is the choice facing Americans: a convicted felon and someone who is apparently in a state of cognitive decline. Is that the best that American can come up with?
Well, it seems so. We've had this now for successive elections. I mean, Gordon Brown often is asked if he wants to make a comeback here, and he says, no, I'm too old for British politics and too young for American politics. And I think that basically sums it up very well. I mean, look, last night was, I think, possibly the most important presidential head-to-head for 30 years in a generation of American politics. Joe Biden had a very low bar to surmount, and he failed to surmount it. And, to get an impression of that, don't just look at what sort of Biden's enemies are saying. Look at what his friends are saying. The New York Times, the doyen of liberal opinion, is unanimous this morning. People like Thomas Friedman coming out, a close friend of the president, saying that, he was in tears last night watching that debate, and he begged him not to run again. And I think that this is really going to lead to a huge debate over the next coming months. And I fear the worst of all words for the Democrat Party, which is they have 3 months endlessly debating whether to replace him or not, keep him on the ticket, and then he loses quite badly.
Rachel, do you agree that's what they'll do, or do you think things might move rather quicker? And is it possible that, one of the other candidates might come forward who does give Donald Trump a better run for his money or not?
I tell you what, I imagine those conversations, I'm certain that those conversations are going on in the highest Democratic circles right now. They've got the Democratic National Convention. There is still time for them for Biden to withdraw, although then they would have the question of, can he carry on being president while he's no longer the Democratic candidate? It's very awkward for them because obviously the primaries have happened. But I think the question of, is this really the best we have to offer against Trump, will be an active conversation. And I think that there is also a lot of anger in the grassroots Democratic Party about how it got to this point, and the people around Biden who have been insulating him for so long, with the outcome that it's now so close and difficult for them to change course. I mean, I have heard talk that this is always the plan. They've got a preferred candidate they're going to parachute in. To that, I would just say, never attribute, what's that phrase? Never attribute conspiracy to where it could just be incompetence.
And Michelle Obama's name is always on the tip of people's tongues. We had a friend of hers on the programme earlier, and they said absolutely not. She's never going to stand. Don't even think about it. But I mean, that would solve things, wouldn't it, Rachel?
Why go for Michelle Obama when you can go for Taylor Swift?
James, Taylor Swift?
I think she's probably in her eras to her right now, so she's much more powerful than the President of the United States. I do think that 2 women will be the crucial thing to this. One is Jill Biden, whether she'll be the crucial person, I think, the kingmaker or kingbreaker in this case, if she tells him to step down, and also potentially Kamala Harris if, I think, she chose not to run as well, then open a much more wider field, because right now they're saying if it's not Biden, it has to be Kamala Harris. But I know she's very unpopular, obviously, because of her successive failures on multiple issues.
And Rachel, quick word on what all this means for an incoming Labour government. Clearly David Lammy, who might well be Foreign Secretary in a few days' time, has been very rude about Trump in the past, talking about him being a fascist with neo-Nazi sympathisers. You know, it is terrible. He's distanced himself from that, but it could make for a very difficult conversation, couldn't it?
Well, David Lammy has made those comments, but if you read this week's edition of the New Statesman, you will find that we have a long interview with David Lammy. Our editor actually went with him on a trip to Washington, where he met a number of key Republican figures, including some who are tipped to be quite high up in Trump's administration were he to get a second term. So I think the pivot, both from Lammy personally and in Labour more generally, is well underway. They recognise that an incoming Labour government will have to work with whoever the president of the United States is, and they're laying the groundwork now.
Well, joining us now is Kimberly Whaley, Professor of US Constitutional Law at the University of Baltimore. Good evening, Kimberly.
Hello there.
I keep hearing from people we're in uncharted territory. The fact that, you know, the idea that this nomination of Joe Biden as the Democrats' nominee could be sort of unpicked potentially. Take us through how uncharted that territory is.
Well, of course, this is the nominee for the primaries, and I don't know that any of this is a time in American history that we've seen what's happening right now. We would have to see at the convention if the delegates that have pledged for Joe Biden in this moment would be willing to shift. And I think politically it would require Joe Biden to step aside and to allow those delegates for the Electoral College to go with a different nominee. It's stunning to imagine that we are here. But on the other hand, I don't think that much changed last night. In that we've had these candidates for a long time. People in the United States are dug in one way or the other. I think what it comes down to is whether there are any independent swing voters that potentially were persuaded last night, because that's ultimately going to decide this election, as happened multiple times in American history, primarily favoring Republican candidates like Donald Trump.
And there aren't that many undecided voters in America, as Frank Luntz was pointing out earlier. But do you, technically speaking, I suppose what we learned last night was the kind of extent of Joe Biden's cognitive decline. People who hadn't perhaps clocked into that saw it on display for everyone to see. So what are the sort of procedures if it's decided a serving president is not medically fit? What are the kind of possible interventions there?
Well, we have the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. This came up during the Reagan administration, where people within his administration thought he was in cognitive decline, reportedly. It also came up during the Trump administration. Former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein reportedly flagged the 25th Amendment. But, you know, it's very narrow. It was designed really to deal with a situation like John F. Kennedy, where a president is assassinated and is somehow, or not assassinated, but is somehow disabled physically. So I don't think that's going to be operative in this moment. It's kind of a dead letter, but it would really require the Democratic Party establishment, the top poobahs, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, almost like what happened with Richard Nixon. When he was on the verge of impeachment, the Republican Party went to the White House and said, listen, politically, we need you to step aside. I think it would take that kind of internal pressure to get the levers of the Democratic Party moving with Joe Biden's consent between now and the convention to have someone else be the nominee and have that on the ballot in November. Breakneck speed, but democracy, frankly, is really at stake, and I've been saying that for years. We cannot have Donald Trump as president in the United States, or this will be the twilight of government by the people in one of the oldest constitutional democracies on the planet.
Kimberly Whaley, Professor of US Constitutional Law at the University of Baltimore, thank you very much for joining us.